My name is David Warner Matheson, and you may already be aware of an important celestial event happening in the next couple weeks, but you may not be aware of some of the fascinating ancient connections surrounding this particular event and what makes it so important. We're rapidly approaching a conjunction of the two largest planets in our solar system, the planets Jupiter and Saturn. A conjunction is an alignment of two or more heavenly bodies from the perspective of an observer on Earth. We observe a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn when these two planets are aligned from our perspective on our planet, which happens whenever Jupiter on its inner track passes Saturn on its outer track around the Sun. Jupiter, being closer to the Sun, makes a more rapid orbit, going around our Sun once every approximately 12 Earth years, while Saturn, on its more exterior track to Jupiter, makes a slower orbit around our Sun once every approximately 30 Earth years. The way these two tracks work out, it means that Jupiter will lap Saturn once every 20 years. That's because Jupiter completes a full 360-degree orbit of the Sun every 12 years, which means that every Earth year, it covers about 30 degrees, which is 360 degrees divided by 12. Saturn, on the other hand, completes a full 360-degree orbit every 30 years, so that means every year it covers about 12 degrees. 360 degrees divided by 30 years is 12 degrees per Earth year. Therefore, Jupiter gains 18 degrees on Saturn every year. 30 minus 12 is 18. So Jupiter is gaining 18 degrees on Saturn every year. Since Saturn only covers 12 degrees and Jupiter covers 30 degrees each year. So to bring the two into alignment again, from our perspective, it takes 18 degrees of difference multiplied by 20 years to get 360 degrees. So 18 times 20 is 360. So that means every 20 years, Jupiter is going to lap Saturn. Thus, conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn occur approximately every 20 years. Actually, it's a tiny bit over the exact period of 20 years. Because Jupiter and Saturn are such important planets, and also the slowest moving of the visible planets, since they're the furthest out from us of the visible planets, their conjunction is the rarest of the planetary conjunctions, and has traditionally been known as a great conjunction. And we are rapidly approaching a spectacular great conjunction in which Jupiter will pass Saturn, and in doing so, the two planets will come together and overlap almost completely in just a few more weeks on December 21st of 2020. Here's a view of the night sky from the perspective of a viewer in the northern hemisphere. We can see Jupiter and Saturn between the constellations Sagittarius and Capricorn, where they've been for months, with Jupiter on its way to overtaking Saturn on its interior orbital path. Jupiter is much brighter than Saturn, but both are clearly visible to the naked eye. As we approach December 21st, watch how the two come together as Jupiter passes Saturn. This is a great conjunction, and this year will be a particularly close path of their orbital tracks from our perspective on Earth, the closest conjunction since 1623, in fact. Notice that the new moon takes place on December 14th. So we will have very dark skies with no moon after sunset up until the 14th, and then we'll get a very thin new crescent on the evening of the 15th and a slightly thicker crescent on the evening of the 16th, and then each night the moon will become a little larger as it waxes and a little brighter and a little higher in the sky. However, Saturn and Jupiter should still be easily visible to the naked eye right up through their great conjunction. Here's a closer view of the two planets, and Here comes the new crescent moon on the 15th and 16th and so on. So you can see them tonight in the early evening hours after the sun sets and watch them grow closer and closer each night between now and the 21st when Jupiter will pass Saturn. So let's watch it one more time, nice and close so you can really see it on the planetarium map. I'm using Stellarium. For a brief discussion of the ancient importance of these great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, let's turn to Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969 and written by two professors, Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deckend. Hamlet's Mill is an extremely seminal text, one which had an enormous impact on the work of many subsequent researchers, including my own. The authors of Hamlet's Mill present abundant evidence for an ancient system which once covered the globe, a system incorporating myth and number and weights and measures, a system so ancient that it was already present in the earliest myths of the cultures of ancient Egypt and of ancient Mesopotamia and of ancient India and of ancient China, but a system which has been covered over by the sands of time and forgotten, glimpsed only in fragments, which remain for us to examine today. You can actually read Hamlet's Mill in its entirety online in a few different places. I provide a link to that on my website, Star Myths of the World, on the resources page, which you can access by scrolling to the menu found at the very bottom of any page of my website. There's a separate menu on the bottom of the page. It's different from the menu on the top or in the hamburger. In Chapter 8 of Hamlet's Mill, Professors Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deckend discuss the cycle created by the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn every 20 years, and they discuss the fact that the ancient system of myth saw this conjunction as a kind of handoff from Saturn to Jupiter of some kind of authority, especially authority over time and measurement. Hamlet's Mill provides abundant evidence from around the world showing that time and measurement are associated with the planet Saturn and with deities associated with the planet Saturn, such as the Greek Titan Kronos, father of Zeus. And this association is understandable because as the farthest visible planet, Saturn has the slowest orbit and can be seen as being the planet that's closest to the realm of the fixed stars and the planet that's measuring out the orbits of the closer planets that orbit faster. All of those have orbital periods that are shorter than the orbit of Saturn. So Saturn is giving the measures. Saturn is the keeper of time. On page 134 of Hamlet's Mill, the authors quote the tradition that Kronos, or Saturn, was banished to sleep in the undersea cave of Ogygia, but that he continued to dream, and those dreams became the plans of Zeus. So Saturn is giving the pattern to Zeus, which is the god Zeus, of course, is associated with Jupiter. The name of Zeus in Latin is Jupiter, which means Zeus the father, Zeus pater. Then they cite an ancient Orphic text. The authors of Hamlet's Mill cite an ancient Orphic text which declares, "The greatest Kronos is giving from above the principles of intelligibility to the demiurge." And here the authors of Hamlet's Mill insert a gloss and say that that's referring to Zeus, the demiurge. And he, Saturn, presides over the whole creation, or demiurgia. This is why Zeus calls him daemon, according to Orpheus, saying, quote, "Set in motion our genus, excellent daemon." And Kronos seems to have with him the highest causes of junctions and separations. He has become the cause of the continuation of begetting and propagation, and the head of the whole genus of Titans from which originates the division of beings. End quote. So the whole creation of all beings is generated by the giver of time. Time creates and then time devours all beings. That's what the ancients are talking about in this Orphic text that Hamlet's Mill is citing. On the facing page opposite that, the authors of Hamlet's Mill reproduce a diagram from Johannes Kepler showing the pattern of the great conjunctions, which trace out a series of triangles around the background of zodiac signs. This triangular pattern made by the great conjunctions is known as the trigon. And as you can see, this trigon, this triangular pattern, turns like a slowly ticking clock hand around the background circle of the zodiac. We'll examine this pattern more closely in a moment. Underneath Kepler's diagram of the trigon, the authors of Hamlet's Mill put a caption which reads, "How Kronos continually gives to Zeus all the measures of the whole creation." Kepler's presentation of the trigon built up by the great conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter every 20 years. That's their label for this picture. This picture is showing how Kronos continually gives to Zeus all the measures of the whole creation. This diagram is Kepler's presentation of the trigon built up by the great conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter every 20 years. And the caption continues, "The motion of this trigon along the zodiacal signs subdivided the cycle of precession, acting as a kind of vernier for this great cycle. To go around the whole zodiac, it takes one angle of the trigon roughly 2,400 years. To move from one sign of an elementary triplicity to the next sign of the same element takes about 800 years." End quote. That'll make more sense when we take a look at the diagram. But Saturn and Jupiter together can be seen. What they're saying is Saturn and Jupiter, their conjunctions, are measuring out the ages. So let's flip forward in Hamlet's Mill to another diagram showing the trigon, which is found between pages 268 and 269 of the book. Here we see another diagram of the trigon and its motion along the zodiacal signs, showing the great conjunctions for the years 1583 through 1763. And remember, they only happen once every 20 years. So let's take a closer look at this diagram to see how it works. First, note that because the planets Jupiter and Saturn orbit along the ecliptic path, that means that they travel against the background belt of stars known as the zodiac, which is divided up into the familiar 12 signs, which we see represented on this diagram, and they were also indicated on that previous trigon diagram. The conventional symbols for the zodiac signs were on the previous one. This one has some pictures of some of the signs plus those symbols for each of the 12 signs. So this diagram indicates within which sign the great conjunctions took place as the trigon moves through the zodiac. So this particular diagram begins with the great conjunction of 1583, and we can see that it's indicated that it took place within the sign of Pisces. And then because they take place every 20 years, the next one's going to be, after 1583, will be the great conjunction of 1603, and we can see that it took place in Sagittarius. And there's an asterisk next to 1603. If you're wondering what that is, it indicates that the Sun was also lined up with Earth, Jupiter, and Saturn during that particular great conjunction in 1603. 20 years later, we see the next great conjunction in the sign of Leo in 1623. Then, 20 years later, we see another great conjunction in Pisces in 1643. So we've made that triangle. The next one is in 1663. It's back in Sagittarius. And then 20 years later, 1683, back in Leo. 20 years later brings us to 1703. And we can see that that clock-like ticking of the trigon as it moves around the zodiac has moved into the sign of Aries, which is the sign that follows Pisces. So it's ticking through the cycle. Pisces is right before Aries, so it was in Pisces, now it's ticked into Aries. So the next great conjunction, of course, will occur in 1723 on this diagram, and that's back in Sagittarius. And then 20 years later, another great conjunction in Leo in 1743, and then the final one that's shown on this diagram is in 1763, again in Aries. So from this diagram we can easily see that the turning of this trigon moves in the same direction that the sun moves through the zodiac during the year. That is, from Pisces to Aries to Taurus and so on, moving in that direction. So this year, 2020, that we're in, as you saw in the earlier planetarium charts, the planets Saturn and Jupiter are in between Sagittarius and Capricorn. And actually, they're closer to Capricorn than Sagittarius as they are approaching this great conjunction of 2020. 20 years ago, in the previous great conjunction, that would have been in the year 2000, the planets passed one another in between the signs of Aries and Taurus, but closer to Taurus. So you see, I put it here on this chart in Taurus. And then 20 years before that, the great conjunction of 1980 took place against the background of stars of the constellation Virgo. Now, the authors of Hamlet's Mill find evidence that the ancients saw the slow rotation of this trigon as a kind of caliper or vernier or second hand ticking within the much larger cycle of precession. The authors of Hamlet's Mill find evidence that the ancients saw the slow rotation of this trigon as a kind of caliper or vernier. A vernier is like a caliper for measuring smaller ticks, smaller measurements. It's like a second hand, ticking within the much larger cycle of precession, which measures out the ages. So the authors of Hamlet's Mill write, quote, "A new zodiacal sign was termed to rule, starting from the day of a great conjunction at the place of the passage. The marginal point of Greek time reckoning was the date of the first Olympic Games. They had been founded in memory of the wrestling of Kronos and Zeus," Pausanias said, end quote. So can you see how a great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn could be allegorized in myth as a wrestling of Kronos and Zeus? And then the authors go on to say that, quote, "Our own era, the age of Pisces, started with a great conjunction in Pisces in the year 6 BC. Now, we're moving from Pisces, the age of Pisces, into the age of Aquarius, but according to the authors of Hamlet's Mill, that wouldn't, the second hand wouldn't tick around to start the age of Aquarius until you get a great conjunction in Aquarius. And so we're still, you can see on this diagram, we're still moving towards that. And then they go on to say, by means of this trigon, Saturn gives continuously the measures to his son Zeus. And they quote the later Neoplatonic philosopher Macrobius, who states quite directly that Saturn is the originator of time. And so now, perhaps you know a little bit more about the majestic cycles of the great planets Jupiter and Saturn, and about the great conjunctions which work their way in a triangular pattern around the background circle of the zodiac down through the ages, through which the measures of all time are given to us. I hope that you can go out, if at all possible, and witness this great conjunction for yourself. The best way is to find Jupiter and Saturn in the night sky beginning now, this week, when there's no moon to get in the way, and then watch them grow closer each night, night after night, until Jupiter overtakes Saturn on the night of the 21st of this month. This year, the paths of the two planets align very closely, so Jupiter and Saturn will be almost on top of one another as they pass, as Jupiter passes Saturn on the 21st. Because their two orbital paths are not on the exact same plane, other great conjunctions are not as spectacular as this one. Sometimes the planets pass with a little bit of space in between the two of them. And also, some years, the conjunction, the great conjunction, takes place very close to the sun, so that the two planets are difficult to see except for maybe just before dawn or just after sunset, or sometimes even impossible to see. So this is an exceptionally good opportunity to witness a great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And as you do so, You can add to your enjoyment and appreciation of this celestial event by contemplating the ancient system described by the authors of Hamlet's Mill, a system so ancient that, in the words of that book, the dust of centuries had already settled upon the remains of this great worldwide archaic construction by the time that the ancient Greeks came upon the scene, a system that incorporates cosmology and mythology and philosophy and metrology and geometry and music and number and time. It's a system that remains in the ancient myths and sacred traditions given to virtually every culture on our planet, from every inhabited continent and island of our earth. And thus, it's a system which unites all of us and shows that we're in fact all closely related, the common inheritors of an ancient treasure which we can still see today in the motions of the heavenly bodies, the planets, and the stars. Thank you so much for watching.